Welcome back to Echoes of History. Tonight we follow the quiet rhythm of a life that rarely makes the sagas, not warriors or raiders, but fishermen. Before the first light touches the horizon, before the gulls begin their cries, the men of the northern coast rise from their beds of straw and fur. The hearth has gone cold in the night. The air inside the hut is damp, heavy with the scent of salt and smoke. A man named Einar, his hair long and unkempt, sits up slowly. His joints creak. A wool cloak around his shoulders and reaches for a small knife by the bedpost, not as a weapon, but to cut a strip of dried fish for his breakfast. He chews without sound. The only noise is the wind pressing against the door. Outside, the world is still dark. The sea lies somewhere beyond the dunes, unseen but present in every sound, a low, endless hum that rolls beneath the gusts of wind. The earth is frozen at the edges, brittle grass coated with frost. Einar steps out. Softly, from nearby huts other figures emerge, his brother Leif still tying his cloak, old Torsten already carrying a coil of rope over his shoulder, a boy barely 16, yawning but determined not to show it. No one speaks much. Speech belongs to daylight. Morning is for work. They walk down to the shore where the boats wait small, rough, their sides patched with tar and plank. The nets, stiff with cold, lie piled beside them. Einar bends to untangle one, his fing. Begins. The rope bites against his skin, leaving faint white marks that disappear as quickly as they form. The sea wind carries the smell of kelp and iron. It clings to everything, hair, wool, skin. When the men push the boats into the water, the sound of wood scraping against rock cuts through the air. The boy slips on the wet sand, catches himself, and pretends not to notice the laughter that follows. Soon they are waist-deep, water splashing against their cloaks. The tide pulls hard. The weight of it tugs like a living thing. With one final shove, the boat slides free, and they climb aboard, dripping and silent. The oars dip into the black water. Each stroke echoes against the hollow of the hull, slow, steady, unhurried. The land fades behind them. The world shrinks to mist, sea, and the sound of breathing. The light of dawn grows by degrees, thin and grey, spreading across the waves like ink diluted in water. The men work by habit. One checks the knots, another. Sail, though there's hardly enough wind to fill it. The boy watches everything, the way Einar's hands move, the rhythm of the oars, the quiet that hangs between each command. Somewhere far off, a gull cries, unseen in the fog. When the first faint shimmer of the sun appears above the horizon, it reveals a world of pale silver. The sea seems endless, smooth but alive, shifting in long, heavy swells. The fishermen lower their nets. They watch them sink, disappearing beneath the surface until even the rope trembles no more. Then comes the waiting, the part no song ever tells, the long hours between effort and result. Einar leans back, squinting toward nothing. His hands rest on the edge of the boat, fingers stained with salt. The boy beside him whispers something, a joke too quiet to catch, and for the first time since dawn, Einar smiles. The sea rocks them gently, a cradle of cold and rhythm. The sound of the oars has stopped. Only the breathing of the men and the murmur remain. The nets drift in the dark below, moving with the current. Above, the sky brightens, color bleeding slowly from gray into faint blue. The world is awakening, but here on the water, it feels as though time itself has slowed to match the tide. As the light grew stronger, the fog began to thin, pulling apart like old wool and revealing the sea in its full breadth. The horizon was a pale, trembling line where the water met the sky, the two almost indistinguishable. The fishermen. Silence, their faces turned toward the morning light. The air stung their cheeks, but it was clean, cold enough to clear the mind, sharp enough to remind the body that it was alive. Einar reached for the nearest net rope and gave it a testing pull. It resisted faintly, heavy with the drag of water but not yet with fish. The others followed suit, checking the tension, feeling for life below. When the current shifted, the ropes trembled like veins under skin. Leif spat into the sea. Old as his memory, an offering perhaps, or a quiet curse against bad luck. The hours that followed were slow. The sea demanded stillness. The men sat with their hands resting on their knees, watching the movement of the water as though it might reveal something. A few gulls circled overhead, their cries harsh against the soft hiss of the waves. In the distance, another boat moved through the mist, the faint outline of men doing the same patient work. The boy, restless, dipped his fingers into the sea. It was colder than he'd expected, a pain that reached the bone. He looked at Einar, who only shook his head. "You'll feel that in your teeth before noon," he said quietly. The boy grinned through chattering lips. Finally, when the sun had climbed halfway into the sky, Einar gave the signal. The men leaned forward together, muscles tightening as they began to haul. The nets came slowly, each pull heavy with water and resistance. The ropes rubbed raw against their palms. For a long moment there was nothing, only the sound of effort, the grunts and low curses of tired men. Then, from beneath the surface, the first glimmer appeared, a flash of silver, a thrash, the sudden weight of life caught in the weave. "Fish!" the boy cried, though it was already obvious. The water broke around them, boiling with movement, herrings, small but countless, beating against the net with a sound like rain. The men pulled harder, lifting the catch over the side. The air filled with the smell of salt and oil and scales, a sharp, clean scent that seemed to erase fatigue for a moment. The boat dipped under the weight, the timbers creaking as the men laughed through their exertion. When the last of the net was in, the catch shimmered in the bottom of the boat, alive with color, blue, silver, green. The men sat back, breathing hard. Leif wiped his forehead with his sleeve and grinned. "Enough to keep us from starving another week," he said. They worked quickly after that, sorting the fish, packing them into baskets lined with seaweed. The sun was warm now, the chill fading from their hands. A faint mist still lingered over the horizon, turning the sea to molten glass. The boy dipped a cup into the water and drank. It was briny, almost unbearable, but he swallowed it without complaint. Einar watched him with the faint smile of a man remembering his own first days on the water. He looked out across the sea toward the distant shape of the coastline. The huts, smoking by now, fires lit for midday meals, children playing along the shore. The women would be mending nets or salting yesterday's catch. Life continued there, steady and unremarkable, as it did here, a rhythm as old as the tide. When the nets were stowed and the boat's weight eased, they turned for home. The oars dipped once more into the dark water, the strokes slow and measured. The wind had shifted. It carried with it the smell of wood smoke from the village. The men rowed in silence, their movements synchronized without thought, their eyes half closed in fatigue and satisfaction. As they drew closer to land, the sound of gulls grew louder. The rocks along the shore shone with moisture, waves broke against them in white bursts of spray. Children appeared first, running into the shallows, shouting and waving. The boy in the boat waved back, his grin wide despite the salt that crusted his lips. The hull scraped against the sand. Einar and Leif jumped out first, hauling the boat higher with slow, steady effort. The others followed, carrying baskets to the shore. The village was alive now, women calling instructions, dogs barking, the smell of fire and drying fish thick in the air. The sea behind them sparkled under the noon sun, its surface calm, almost gentle. But the men knew better. It gave and it took as it pleased. And tomorrow, before dawn, they would be out there again, rowing into the fog, waiting for the nets to tighten, listening to the same old song of the wind and the waves. For now, though, there was warmth. There was food. There was the simple satisfaction of having survived another morning on the edge of the world. By midday, the village was fully awake, pulsing with small, familiar noises. The rasp of knives against wooden boards, the clatter of buckets, the distant sound of children arguing over nothing. Smoke rose from the cooking huts in thin, steady columns, caught by the cold wind and carried inland toward the low green hills. The sea, once grey and restless, now gleamed pale blue beneath the thin northern sun, calm for the moment, though everyone knew it would not stay so for long. Einar sat on an overturned barrel by the drying racks, mending a torn section of net. His hands moved with slow precision, the muscles remembering each knot without thought. The twine was damp and rough. He could feel the grit of salt working into his skin. Beside him, Leif sharpened a gutting knife with a flat stone, its rhythm almost musical. Between them hung the smell of fish and brine, heavy but comforting in its familiarity. The boy, whose name was Arn, worked a few paces away, turning fish on the drying frames so that the sun struck them evenly. His hands were red from the cold, but his movements were quick, eager to please. He glanced often toward the older men, hoping one might notice. Eventually, Einar did. "Don't rush," he said quietly, not looking up. "The sea doesn't hurry, and—" The upper huts came the sound of women working, the scrape of knives, the hiss of boiling brine, the creak of rope pulleys as barrels were lowered toward the shore. Salted herring would keep through the winter if sealed well enough, though the air would carry its scent for months. A few dogs lingered nearby, tails twitching, waiting for scraps. The gulls circled lower now, fearless and hungry, their shadows flickering across the racks like passing clouds. Inside one of the huts, a fire burned. Lo! A woman sat beside it, stirring a pot thick with barley and broth. Her hair was tied in a rough braid, her hands red and cracked from brine. She hummed softly under her breath, a melody with no beginning or end. The door curtain shifted as the wind came through, and for a moment the smoke rose straight upward, illuminated by the thin light filtering through the roof. By the time the meal was ready, the men had gathered around the hearth, bowls in hand, eating without ceremony. The soup. Simple, fish, grain, and whatever herbs had survived the frost, but it filled the room with warmth. Arn ate last, sitting cross-legged near the doorway, his bowl balanced carefully on his knees. When he finished, he licked the wooden spoon clean and leaned back, eyes half closed. Outside, the tide was changing. The waves reached higher on the shore, pushing against the rocks with quiet persistence. The afternoon light flattened the world, sea and sky and land merging into one endless shade of grey-blue. The gulls screamed overhead, though their cries sounded distant, absorbed by the wind. After the meal, the men returned to work. The larger fish were packed into barrels, layered with salt, the lids sealed with pitch. Smaller catches were laid upon racks, the air drying them to hardness that would last the season. The rhythm was constant, unspoken. No one needed to instruct anyone else. Each knew his place, his task, the order of things. At the edge of the village, an old man sat, himself carving small wooden figures, boats, birds, faces with deep-set eyes. He worked slowly, the knife gliding in long strokes, wood curling away like thin shavings of butter. When he finished one, he placed it on a flat stone beside him. There were dozens there already, each shaped by the same quiet patience. Children sometimes took them, though he never minded. "The sea gives," he'd say, "and so should we." The light began to fade early, as it always did in this part of the lengthened across the beach, the warmth of the fire inside the huts becoming a visible glow through the slits of the doors. Einar stood for a long time at the water's edge, watching the tide creep closer, the foam curling around his boots. The smell of salt was sharp, almost bitter. Behind him, the village carried on, voices low, the sound of laughter rising now and then, the creak of a door, the rustle of wind through ropes and sails. The men who had fought the sea that morning would sleep. Soon, their muscles aching, their minds already half in dream. Tomorrow would be the same. Another tide, another catch, another cold dawn on the edge of the northern world. Einar turned at last and walked back toward the huts. The gulls had fallen silent. Only the sound of waves remained, endless, steady like breath. Evening settled slowly over the village, the light folding itself into thin layers of grey and amber before vanishing altogether. The air cooled sharply once the sun sank back. The distant cliffs. A low mist began to form along the shore, crawling in from the water, moving between the boats and drying racks until it wrapped the whole settlement in a damp, flickering haze. The fires inside the huts burned brighter now, each doorway a soft square of light against the growing dark. Smoke rose from the chimneys and drifted sideways in the wind, carrying with it the mingled scents of pine resin, salt, and cooked fish. The voices of the villagers softened. Work gave way to rest. From somewhere up the hill, a dog barked twice, answered by another from the beach, and then the sound was lost to the steady rush of the tide. Einar sat on a wooden stool outside his hut, a wool cloak around his shoulders, mending a length of rope by the light of a small lantern. The fibers scratched against his hands as he twisted them back together, sealing each frayed end with tar. Beside him lay a small pile of finished cord, neatly coiled. His brother Leif emerged from the door. Carrying a wooden cup of ale, he handed it over without a word and sat beside him. For a long time neither spoke. They simply watched the fog drift in from the sea, the pale glow of the horizon fading into nothing. "The wind's changing," Leif said at last. His voice was low, calm. "Aye," Einar replied. "It'll bring weather." Leif nodded, took a drink and passed the cup back. "Then tomorrow we'll stay close." The air between them smelled of sea and smoke. From the neighboring hut came sound of a woman's laughter, brief and bright, followed by the deep rumble of a man's voice. It was a good sound, domestic, ordinary, the kind that kept the cold away. Somewhere nearby, a child sang a half-remembered tune, his voice rising and falling like a wave before breaking into giggles. By the docks, the last of the fishermen checked their boats one final time before nightfall. They tied knots, adjusted ropes, turned the hulls so the tide wouldn't drag them away while they slept. Lanterns they carried cast trembling reflections upon the water, yellow, gold, and pale green, rippling together like stars caught in motion. The sea itself was darker now, a vast, slow-moving mirror. Inside the huts, families gathered for the evening meal. Wooden bowls filled with broth and bits of salted meat steamed in the dim light. A few drops of oil floated on the surface, glinting faintly like coins. The men ate slowly, tired but content. Children curled up near the hearth. Sleep before the bowls were empty. The wind pressed against the thatched roofs, sighing through the gaps in the wood. When the eating was done, Einar reached for the small harp that hung on the wall above the fire. Its frame was simple pine, its strings made from sheep gut, worn thin by years of use. He plucked at it idly, no tune in mind, letting the notes find their own way. The sound was faint but pure, filling the room like breath. Leif leaned back, eyes half-closed, listening. The boy sat cross-legged near the hearth, his gaze fixed on the flicker of the flames. Outside, the tide continued to rise. The boats rocked gently, their ropes creaking against the posts. A gull cried once, somewhere beyond the fog, and then silence took hold again. The moon, faint and distant, appeared through a break in the clouds, turning the mist into a pale shimmer. After a while, Einar set the harp aside and stirred the fire with a stick. "Tomorrow," he said softly, almost to himself, "we mend the nets. The sea can wait a day." Leif grunted in agreement. Arn nodded solemnly, though sleep was already pulling at his eyes. The fire burned lower. The glow of the coals cast their faces in shades of red and gold, the shadows deep behind them. When they finally lay down to rest, the wind had shifted completely, blowing inland. It carried with it the distant scent of rain, faint but sure. By the time the last lamp was extinguished, the village had vanished into the mist. The waves was all that remained, unending, patient, like the breath of something older than time itself. And within that sound, the rhythm of life continued, quiet, enduring, unchanged. The rain came before dawn, soft at first, a thin whisper across the rooftops, then heavier, steady, unrelenting. It struck the thatch in slow rhythm, turning the paths between huts into dark ribbons of mud. The smell of wet wood and salt filled the air. Inside, the fishermen slept a little longer than. There was no point in rushing toward a sea that would not have them. Einar woke first. He sat up, listening to the sound of rain against the walls. It was an old sound, constant, familiar, almost comforting. The hearth had gone cold again, though a faint wisp of smoke still rose from the embers. He stirred it back to life, feeding it with a handful of dry moss, then added a piece of driftwood from the stack by the door. The fire caught slowly, its light flickering along the rough beams above. Him! Leif snored nearby, one arm flung over his eyes. Arn lay curled under a wool blanket, only his hair visible. Einar watched them for a moment, then stood, stretching until his shoulders cracked. He took a clay cup from the shelf, filled it with rainwater dripping through a gap in the eaves, and drank. It was cold and clean, tasting faintly of smoke from last night's fire. Outside, the village was quiet. The sea was hidden behind a curtain of grey, its voice louder than usual. Breaking hard against the rocks, the drying racks stood empty. The nets, heavy with water, sagged beneath the weight. A few figures moved in the mist, women collecting buckets of rain, an old man walking slowly toward the shore, a dog following at his heels. By mid-morning, the men gathered in the long hut near the beach. It smelled of tar, salt, and damp wool. The fire in the center smoked heavily, struggling against the wet air. They sat in a loose circle, some repairing nets, others sharpening hooks or patching the seams of their clothes. Einar worked quietly beside Leif, his knife moving in small, sure motions. Rain drummed upon the roof, steady as a heartbeat. Thorsten, the oldest among them, spoke first. Storms coming from the west. The gulls flew inland at dawn. Einar nodded. Then we wait, Thorsten grunted. Always waiting. Sea takes our time as easy as it takes our catch. Leif chuckled. Would you rather it took you instead? The men laughed. Joy, but recognition. Every man in that room had lost someone to the sea, a brother, a friend, a father. The laughter faded into silence. The rain filled the space where their voices had been. Arn sat near the fire, trying to twist rope into a knot as Einar had shown him. His fingers were clumsy, the rope too thick. He frowned, untangled it, tried again. Leif watched him for a while before speaking. Patience, he said. You'll learn it here if you learn nothing else. The hours passed. Slowly, the rain softened by degrees until it was no more than a fine mist drifting through the open doorway. The men's work became more deliberate, quieter. Einar finished repairing a length of net and set it aside, his hands raw from the wet fibers. He looked out toward the water. The tide was high. The foam reached the base of the wooden posts. The color of the sea had changed, not blue, not gray, but the deep iron shade of winter. When the rain finally stopped, the world ceased. Its breath. The air was still, the clouds heavy but unmoving. Steam rose from the rooftops where the sun touched them. The men stepped outside, stretching their legs, blinking against the dim light. The village glistened, every surface slick with moisture, every puddle reflecting the pale sky. Children appeared first, running barefoot through the mud, laughing as they splashed each other. Their mothers shouted after them, but without conviction. The dogs barked and chased the children there. Paws leaving wet prints on the path. Life resumed, as it always did, cautious but persistent. Einar walked down to the beach, boots sinking into the wet sand. The sea was calmer now, though the horizon remained hidden beneath a wall of cloud. He stood there for a long while, listening to the waves, feeling the damp wind on his face. Behind him, the village hummed faintly, the clatter of pots, the creak of drying wood, the faint sound of someone singing as they worked. He closed his eye. Let the sound of the sea fill him. It was endless, unchanging, beyond comprehension, and yet it was home. For men like him, the sea was both enemy and companion, a thing to fear and depend upon in equal measure. He had never tried to understand it. He simply lived beside it, as his father had and his father's father before him. When he opened his eyes again, the clouds had begun to break. A single beam of sunlight reached down through the mist, touching the surface of the water. Briefly to silver. It was gone a moment later, swallowed by grey. But it was enough. He turned back toward the huts, the sound of the tide following him all the way. By late afternoon, the clouds finally began to drift apart, pulled westward by the wind that had been building since morning. The rain left behind a world washed clean, the air sharp and briny, the light diffused and pale, as though the sun itself were weary from its struggle with the storm. Along the beach, the wet sand, smooth and unmarred except for the faint impressions of boots and the prints of gulls pacing near the waterline. Einar and Leif stood by their boat, inspecting the damage. The ropes were swollen, the hull damp but intact, the tar still holding. Salt crystals clung to the edges like frost. "She held better than I thought," Leif muttered, running his hand along the side. Einar nodded, testing a joint with his thumb. "Aye, she's older than half the men here and still does what she's told." Behind them, the village had come back to life. Smoke curled upward from every chimney. The women had set the fish racks upright again, shaking water from the cloth covers, the sound of flapping fabric mingling with the low roll of waves. Children carried baskets of driftwood from the shore to the huts, the smallest ones stumbling under the weight, but laughing anyway. The air was filled with their voices, the rare brightness of laughter after long silence. The sea was calm now, but the fishermen knew its deceitful moods. They would not sail tonight. Instead, they worked to repair what the storm had frayed. Nets were spread across the grass to dry, heavy with knots and seaweed. Einar crouched to untangle a line, his fingers deft despite the cold. Beside him, Arn watched, trying to mimic the motion. "Like this," Einar said softly, showing the boy how to twist and pull in rhythm, not with force. "If you fight the rope, it tightens. You work with it, it loosens." The boy nodded. Serious, his brow furrowed with concentration. The wind caught his hair and tossed it into his eyes. He didn't notice. His hands moved clumsily, but he persisted, the way young men always do when trying to impress those who have lived long enough to stop pretending they know everything. Leif carried a barrel of salted fish to the storage hut, his boots sinking into the damp ground. "We'll need another one by next week," he called over his shoulder. "The sea's stingy this season." Ein. "Look up. It gives what it can," Leif grinned faintly, "and takes when it pleases." The sun appeared briefly, low on the horizon, its light stretched thin across the water. It struck the wet surfaces of the boats, the fish racks and the sand, painting them in shades of amber and grey. The world seemed suspended, quiet, reflective, between day and night. For a moment, even the waves stilled. As the light began to fade, a horn sounded from the headland, a single low note that echoed across the bay. It signaled the return of a distant boat, one that had been gone longer than expected. The villagers turned toward the sound instinctively, hands raised to shield their eyes. On the horizon, just beyond the dark edge of the water, a small sail appeared. The returning fishermen had weathered the storm farther out, waiting for calmer seas before returning. Their boat was heavy with catch. Even from shore, the outline of piled baskets was visible. The people moved quickly now, the older boys running to the docks, the women gathering baskets, the dogs barking excitedly. The air filled with energy again, the hum of movement, the spark of reunion. Einar and Leif joined them, wading knee-deep into the surf to help drag the boat in. The water was cold, biting, but they didn't seem to feel it. The ropes were thrown, caught, tied off. The hull scraped against sand. Hands met hands, pulling, steadying, lifting. When the boat was secure, one of the returning men, a grey fisherman named Rurik, stepped ashore and grinned through his exhaustion. "Thought you drunk yourselves to death while we were gone," he said. Laughter followed, rough and warm. "And miss a storm like that?" Leif replied. "Never." The catch was good, better than any had hoped. Silver fish spilled from the baskets in shining heaps, each scale catching the last glimmer of daylight. The villagers worked quickly, sorting, salting, preparing. The smell of the sea filled the air, strong, clean, alive. As night came on, the horizon turned deep blue, the first stars appearing faintly above the water. Fires were lit along the shore, flickering against the darkening sky. The men sat together by the flames, bowls of stew in their hands, their faces ruddy in the light. The boy Arn sat among them now, quiet but proud, listening to their stories, half-truths, memories, and jokes that lost none of their warmth for being repeated 100 times before. The waves rolled in and out. Breath. The gulls had gone silent. The sea was a mirror again, holding the reflection of stars and firelight, the two blurring together until it was impossible to tell where the earth ended and the sky began. Somewhere behind them, the women sang softly as they worked, their voices carrying through the cool air, weaving in and out of the sound of the tide. It was not a song of triumph or sorrow, just the same old tune sung every time the sea gave back what it had taken. And so the night deepened, the fires burned low, and the village once again settled into its rhythm, the rhythm of the sea, the nets, the wind, and the endless, unspoken gratitude of those who had survived another day. When the fires along the beach burned down to embers, the village entered its gentlest hour. The storm was gone, the sea subdued, and the night air clear enough to taste of salt and ash. The fishermen sat in a loose circle near the last of the flames, their faces turned toward the warmth, their shadows stretching behind them toward the water. The sound of their low voices blended with the hiss of waves on the sand. Nothing they said mattered much, half stories, half murmurs, words spoken for the comfort of sound itself. Einar leaned back on his elbows, watching sparks drift upward into the darkness until they vanished. His brother Leif sat beside him, the bowl of stew long since emptied, his head bowed as if listening to the fire crackle. "You remember when we were boys," Leif said softly, and thought the sea was endless adventure. Einar's smile was slow. "Aye, and then we learned it was just work." Leif chuckled under his breath. "A cruel teacher, the sea." "Aye," Einar said again, "but fair." The older men laughed quietly at something Rurik said about his first boat sinking before it ever left the dock. The boy Arn listened wide-eyed, his hands wrapped around his knees, trying to imagine a world where such stories were ordinary. He looked at the faces, the scars, the calloused hands, the creases deepened by wind and salt, and understood that these men belonged to the sea as much as their boats did. Behind them, the village lay hushed. The light from the hut windows flickered faintly, softened by fog that had begun to creep back inland. A dog barked once, then went still. The world narrowed to the sound of fire, breath, and tide. When the bowl of stew made its final round, Rurik stood, stretching his back until it cracked. "Enough talk," said, voice rough but not unkind. "Tomorrow comes quick." The others murmured in agreement, standing one by one, stamping their boots to shake off the cold. They scattered toward their huts, each carrying a bit of the fire's warmth in their clothes, each glancing once more toward the sea before closing their doors. Einar lingered a while longer. The tide was rising again, the moon low and bright above it. The water's surface glowed faintly, broken now and then by the glint of small waves. Walked down to the edge, boots sinking into the damp sand, and crouched there, watching the foam curl around the stones. The rhythm soothed him, steady and ancient. It was the same rhythm his father had known, and his father before him, the same pulse that beat beneath every life in the village. He reached down, letting his hand trail in the cold water. It bit his skin, sharp as memory, but he didn't pull away. Somewhere far beyond sight, whales moved in the deep, following routes older. Maps, The sea beneath him was alive with what men could never see: currents, silence, unknowable things. Behind him, footsteps approached. It was Leif, cloak drawn tight. He stood beside his brother, saying nothing for a long while. The only sound between them was the sea. "We'll have clear weather tomorrow," he said at last. Einar nodded. "We'll go early. Nets need a heavy catch before frost comes." Leif looked toward the horizon, where the first hint of dawn's pale grey waited. "It ends, does it?" Einar smiled faintly. "That's how we know we're alive." They turned back toward the huts, walking slowly, the wet sand crunching beneath their boots. The fires had gone out completely now, leaving only the faint light of the moon to silver the edges of the world. The village slept soundly, breathing in rhythm with the tide. Inside their hut, Arn was already curled up by the dying hearth, his hair tangled, his face calm. Leif lay down beside him, closing his eyes without. Einar added one last piece of wood to the fire and sat beside it, staring into the coals until they dimmed to red. Outside, the sea whispered endlessly, the same song it had sung before the first boat was built, before the first man cast a net into its depths. And when sleep finally came to the fisherman, it came like the tide itself, quiet, slow, unstoppable. Morning returned quietly, almost without color. A thin grey light spread across the horizon, blurring sea and sky. Sheet! The mist hung close to the water, soft and unmoving, as if the world had forgotten to wake. From inside the huts came the first low sounds of stirring, the rustle of wool, the scrape of wood, the faint crackle of kindling coaxed back into flame. Einar rose before the others. He dressed in silence, layering his damp cloak over his shoulders, then stepped outside into the cold. The air stung his lungs, each breath tasted of salt and smoke. The village still slept, but the sea was awake. It moved in slow, measured breaths, the sound of waves faint but constant. Above it all hung the smell of tide, brine, kelp, wet sand, life. He walked toward the boats, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The sand was firm where the waves had receded, dark and glistening in the dim light. Nets hung from wooden posts like ghostly curtains, beads of water sliding from them in thin threads. The world felt suspended between night and day, waiting for something to begin. Sudden and sharp, breaking the stillness. The sound echoed along the beach, answered by another farther away. Soon the others would wake. The men would gather their tools, the women would light the morning fires, and smoke would rise again into the grey sky. For now, Einar stood alone, the only figure between sea and land. Leif emerged not long after, his cloak pulled tight, a bundle of rope slung over one shoulder. "You never sleep long," he said, voice rough from disuse. "Can't," Einar replied. "The tide doesn't wait." Leif grunted in agreement and set down the rope. "She looks calm. For now." They worked in silence, checking the boat, tightening knots, testing each oar for cracks. Their movements were practiced, unhurried, born of repetition. Every action had its place, its rhythm. By the time Arn appeared, rubbing sleep from his eyes, the boat was nearly ready. He carried a small basket of bread and dried fish, breakfast wrapped in linen. "My mother said not to this," he said, setting it down beside the nets. Leif smiled faintly. "Good lad. She knows we'd starve without her." Arn looked out at the sea, its surface smooth and dull as metal. "Will it be rough today?" Einar squinted toward the horizon. "Hard to tell. The sea's like a woman, quiet before she decides what she wants." The boy didn't laugh. He only nodded, as if that were an answer to something larger. By the time the sun broke the line of the clouds, the men were already raw. Oars cutting the surface in slow, even strokes. The village shrank behind them until it was no more than a smudge of smoke and color. The water was cold, but not cruel. It moved under the boat in long, rolling swells, as steady as breathing. For a while, no one spoke. The sound of the oars, the soft hiss of the tide, and the faint creak of wood were enough. The air smelled of salt and promise. When they reached deeper water, Einar nodded, and the men set the nets. They sank beneath the sea, in long arcs, vanishing into the depths. Then came the waiting again, the endless, familiar waiting. The men sat still, eyes scanning the water for movement, for change. The mist began to lift, revealing a horizon that stretched unbroken in all directions. The world was open, wide, but empty. Arn broke the silence first. "What do you think lies out there?" Einar didn't answer at once. He followed the boy's gaze, then said quietly, "Nothing that wants to be found." Leif chuckled. "Everything we've already lost." The boy smiled uncertainly, unsure if it was a joke. The men's laughter faded into the sound of waves. Time passed unnoticed. The sun climbed, turning the sea from steel to silver, then to blue. Gulls wheeled above, calling harshly, then diving low to skim the surface. Einar leaned back, his eyes half closed. His body swayed with the rhythm of the water. He thought of home, the crackle of the fire, the smell of bread, the sound of someone laughing in another room. The sea held all those memories too, buried somewhere beneath its moving skin. When the nets began to tremble, they moved as one. The ropes tightened, heavy and alive. The men pulled in rhythm, their bodies bending and rising together. The net surfaced in a gleam of silver, fish thrashing, water flying in every direction. Arn laughed aloud this time, the sound bright against the monotone of the waves. They hauled the catch aboard, muscles straining, breath steaming in the cold air. The boat rocked but held. The sea accepted their effort without malice. When it was done, they sat among the glimmering fish, panting, their faces flushed. Einar looked down at the catch and smiled faintly. "Good," he said simply. "Enough to make the day worth the waking." The others nodded. The sea was calm, the sky clear, and the nets full. In a world ruled by tide and weather, there was no greater blessing. The boat turned for home, its oars dipping once more into the endless blue. Behind them, the sun shone on the waves like scattered coins, and the sea whispered softly, not in anger, not in warning, but in recognition. By the time the men reached the shallows, the tide had begun to fall. The sea withdrew with its quiet strength, leaving ribbons of wet sand that gleamed under the low sun. The air was cool but soft now, washed clean by the morning's mist. The sound of the oars scraping against pebbles carried through the stillness. Children came running from the huts before the men had even called out, their bare feet splashing through the surf, their laughter carried on the wind. Einar stepped into the water first, his boots sinking into the sand. The cold climbed up through him, sharp and bracing. He caught the bowline Leif tossed and began to pull, his movements slow and deliberate. Arn jumped down to help, the water rising past his knees. "Careful," Einar warned, but the boy only grinned, gripping the rope tighter. Together they hauled the boat ashore until its keel rested against the rocks. The villagers gathered quickly. The smell of fish filled the air again, raw, metallic, alive. Women brought baskets lined with seaweed. The older men inspected the catch, nodding in approval. Someone clapped Einar on the shoulder. Someone else said, "The sea's been kind today." Einar only smiled, wiping his hands against his cloak. "For now," he said, half to himself. Leif began sorting the fish into piles, herring, cod, flounder. The scales caught the light and scattered it across the sand. Arn carried the smaller fish to the drying racks, his boots squelching in the mud. He worked quickly, eager to prove his worth. A dog followed him, nose twitching, tail low but hopeful. At the far end of the beach, women tended to the smoke fires used for curing. The scent of burning alderwood drifted across the shore, sweet, heavy, clinging to everything. Thin wisps of smoke curled upward, pale against the darker sky. Seabirds hovered near, crying out. Voices waiting for scraps. By noon, the beach was a scene of movement and rhythm. Nets were washed and stretched across stones. Barrels were filled with brine. The dull clatter of wood against wood and the steady sound of knives striking fish bones merged into a kind of work song. The people didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The pattern of the day was as old as the village itself. Einar sat for a moment on an overturned crate, his hands resting loosely between his knees. His paw split in small places, raw from rope and salt. He rubbed them together absently, feeling the roughness of skin against skin. Leif came over, carrying a mug of warm ale. "Here," he said, passing it down. "You'll dry yourself out faster than the nets." Einar drank, the liquid sharp but soothing. He exhaled, watching the steam curl upward. "How many years, you think, we've done this?" Leif shrugged. "All of them." The sea lay quiet again, a vast mirror broken only by the faint outgoing tide. In the distance, the horizon shimmered with light, the faintest suggestion of new clouds gathering beyond it. The day had that fragile balance that always came between calm and storm, a stillness too pure to last. As the work slowed, the sound softened. The children had wandered up the dunes to collect shells. The women worked more slowly now, tired from hours bent over the racks. The men stacked the empty baskets in neat rows. Einar stood, stretching his back, then turned toward the sea once more. The waves moved in low sighs, spreading thin sheets of foam that broke and vanished before reaching his boots. The water glowed with afternoon light, each wave a thin edge of gold before folding into itself. Arn came to stand beside him, his face flushed and bright. "Will we go again tomorrow?" Einar watched the sea a long time before answering. "If she allows it." Arn frowned slightly, not understanding. "The sea doesn't choose." Einar smiled. "The horizon. Doesn't she?" They stood there in silence, the boy and the man, the sea whispering its old secrets at their feet. Behind them, the village buzzed faintly, the smoke from the fires rising straight into the pale sky. Everything smelled of salt and wood and life. When the sun began to sink, turning the clouds the color of iron and amber, the villagers gathered what was left of the day, the baskets, the tools, the nets, and carried them home. The last light fell on the wet sand, on the faint tracks leading from sea to shore, and on the slow, endless movement of water that never truly stopped. As the first star appeared above the horizon, Einar looked once more toward the open water and said, in a voice too quiet for anyone else to hear, "Tomorrow, then." The waves answered in their own language, the same they had always spoken, low, patient, eternal. The night that followed came clear and cold, the kind that made sound travel farther than it should. The waves seemed under the stars, the gulls quieter. Every hut glowed faintly from within, its light flickering across damp wood and smoke-streaked thatch. The air smelled of ash, fish oil, and seaweed drying in the salt wind. Inside the largest hut, the men gathered once more. The day's work was done. The sea had given enough to fill the barrels and feed the hearths. The room was warm, thick with steam from bowls of broth set upon the fire. Shadows moved along the walls, stretching and bending with the flame. Leif sat near the center, a wooden cup in his hand. His hair, still damp from the sea, clung in dark strands against his neck. "It's strange," he said, his voice slow, thoughtful. "We live here our whole lives, and still the sea feels older than us." Torsten grunted from across the room, his gray beard glistening in the firelight. "That's because it is. She was here before the first of our names was ever spoken." Einar, sitting in silence near the doorway, lifted his gaze. "And she'll, when the last one's forgotten." For a while, no one replied. The only sound was the fire and the slow clink of wooden spoons against bowls. Outside, the wind stirred the dried fish on the racks, their faint rustle like a chorus of whispers. After the meal, the talk turned softer. Old stories surfaced, half memories, half truths of great storms, lost boats, nights when the sea had glowed like molten silver under the full moon. Rurik, ever the storyteller, leaned forward, eyes catching. "Light, I saw it once," he said. "Far to the north, the sky burned green and the sea burned back. You could see your shadow at midnight." Arn, sitting cross-legged by the fire, listened with wide eyes. "Did you touch it?" he asked. Rurik chuckled. No, boy, you don't touch light. You just let it pass through you and hope it leaves something behind. Outside, the tide began to climb again, its sound deeper now, closer. The night was pulling in, but no one inside the hut seemed inner. Sleep! Leif reached for the small harp and strummed a few uneven chords. The melody was simple, a rhythm to fill the silence, not to replace it. One by one, the men joined in with low humming, their voices rough but steady, merging with the sound of the wind. It was not a song meant for joy, nor for sorrow. It was the kind sung only at the edge of the world, where men worked by tide and lived by patience. When the fire burned low, Einar stood and stepped outside. The cold met him, clean and sharp. The sky above was a field of stars, endless and close. The moon had not yet risen, and the world was lit only by starlight and the pale shimmer of the sea. The boats rested high on the sand, their hulls black shapes against the water. He walked down to the edge of the shore. The sand was cool beneath his boots, the surf curling in slow, whispering waves. Somewhere far out, a whale exhaled, a deep, hollow sound that rolled across the night like a sigh. Einar listened. Behind him, the village had grown still. No more laughter, no more song, only the faint murmur of fire and the steady pulse of the sea. He crouched, scooping a handful of water into his palm, watching it drip through his fingers. The light of the stars trembled in each drop. He thought of the men sleeping behind him, of Arn dreaming of voyages that would never come true, of Leif who laughed too easily to hide his weariness. He thought of the years ahead, the same work, the same tides, the same endless cycle. Yet there was comfort in it, in the repetition, in the return. The sea was both a cage and a companion. He stayed there until the first sign of dawn, a faint whitening at the horizon, a single line dividing sea from sky. The stars began to fade. The tide turned again. Einar rose, brushed the sand from his hands, and looked once more toward the vast, dark water. "Another day," he murmured. His breath clouded the air. Then he turned back toward the village, where the first smoke of morning fires was already rising into the pale grey sky, thin and sure. The pale grey of dawn deepened into the quiet blue of morning. A frost had settled in the night. Each blade of grass along the dunes shone white, each rope stiff with cold. The air was so still that every sound seemed magnified. The creak of wood as a door opened, the muffled cough of someone stirring a fire, the faint rattle of oars against the hulls of the boats. Einar was all. Water's edge, he stood motionless, his breath visible in the air, his eyes fixed on the slow roll of the tide. It was calm, unnaturally calm, a surface too smooth, a silence too wide. He knew what that meant. The sea was holding its breath. Leif joined him, cloak pulled tight, his beard rimed with frost. "The wind's hiding," he said. "Never a good sign." Einar nodded, the movement barely visible. "She's waiting." They both looked out over the horizon, where a line of dark clouds sat, heavy and unmoving. It was too soon to tell whether they'd come closer. The others arrived one by one, Rurik with his nets slung over his shoulder, Torsten carrying a bucket of pitch, Arn running ahead of them all, his boots kicking up wet sand. The boy's energy felt almost strange in the heavy stillness of the morning. "Are we going out?" he asked, breathless. Einar squinted at the sky. "Not yet. We'll mend what needs mending first." The men spread their nets across the ground. They were stiff, still crusted with salt from the last catch. Einar knelt and began to work, his fingers deft even in the cold. The rope rasped against his palms, rough and steady. Around him, the others moved in rhythm, voices low, hands sure, each knot tied with the same slow care. The boy watched for a time, then crouched beside Einar, imitating his movements. The twine slipped between his fingers, loose and awkward. Einar didn't correct him. He let the boy learn by feel, by fail. How all of them had learned by time, by repetition, by listening to the language of the rope and the sea. A gull landed nearby, watching them with its head cocked, its feathers ruffled in the faint breeze. Another followed, then three more, their white bodies stark against the grey water. They were waiting too. The sea fed everything here, even the creatures that never touched a net. By midday, the clouds had moved closer. The light dimmed to a dull silver. The air thickened. The villagers worked faster now, knowing without speaking that weather was coming. Women carried bundles of dried fish into storage huts, tying the doors tight with rope. Smoke from the cooking fires drifted low, pressed down by the weight of the air. Leif straightened from his work, squinting toward the horizon. It'll reach us by nightfall. Einar wiped his hands on his cloak. Then we finish before it does. They carried the repaired nets to the boats, coiling them neatly, checking the planks and pegs. Weakness. The tide had begun to rise, pulling against the posts that anchored the vessels. The water looked darker now, its surface restless. Arn stood beside the boat, staring out to sea. "It doesn't look angry," he said softly. Einar glanced at him. "It never does until it's too late." The boy looked back at the waves, frowning, as though trying to see something beneath the surface. He shivered, though the wind hadn't yet begun to blow. When the last of the nets was secured, the men gathered. Near the fire pit by the dunes, someone poured ale into wooden cups, someone else brought a loaf of coarse bread. They ate without hurry, the warmth of the fire fighting the chill that crept in from the shore. The talk was quiet, the kind that came only when men knew the sea was listening. Far out, the line of clouds had thickened, its edges dark as iron. The horizon seemed to vanish beneath it, swallowed whole. The air grew heavy, tasting faintly of rain and metal. The gulls lifted from the rocks, crying once before vanishing inland. Leif threw the last of the wood onto the fire. Sparks leapt, then faded. "We'll stay close tonight," he said. Einar nodded. "She'll break before dawn." As the light drained from the sky, the sea turned to slate. The first drops of rain came without warning, fat, cold, sudden. The men scattered for shelter, their cloaks flapping behind them like torn sails. Within minutes, the beach was empty, the waves hissing against the rising wind. Einar sat by the door, listening. The storm gathered outside, slow but certain, its first rumble distant, its breath just beginning to stir. He closed his eyes and waited for it, the familiar sound of rain striking wood, the sea rising to meet the sky. Outside, the nets swayed, the boats creaked against their posts, and the wind carried the scent of the storm into the heart of the sleeping village. The storm arrived in the deep of night. It did not come all at once, but in slow build of sound and motion. The first gusts pressed against the huts like a held breath, the second shook their wooden frames, and the third brought the sea itself roaring to the very edge of the dunes. Rain fell in long, slanting lines, driven hard by the wind. The walls groaned. Smoke from the hearths was forced back down the chimneys, filling the rooms with the sharp sting of ash. Einar sat beside the fire, his cloak pulled tight, his face lit intermittently by each flare of lightning. Outside, the world flickered between black and white, a single instant of perfect clarity, then blindness again. Leif paced the length of the hut, restless. "It's worse than last year," he said, his voice nearly lost beneath the wind. "The tide's higher already." Einar didn't answer. He was listening, not to Leif, but to the rhythm beneath the noise, the pulse of the sea against the land. He could hear it through the floorboards, through the very bones of the hut, a deep, endless percussion. Arn sat near the hearth, knees pulled to his chest, staring at the door as if expecting it to break open. His lips moved slightly, whispering to himself, though the words were lost to the storm. When the door did finally shift, not breaking, but bending, Leif crossed the room in 2 strides and threw his shoulder against it. The wind pushed back like a living thing, breathing salt and cold into the space. Rain lashed through the small gaps in the wood, scattering sparks from the fire. "Hold it," Einar barked, his voice sharp for the first time that night. Together they pressed against the door until the latch caught again. The sound outside was immense now, the roar of water, the tearing of wind, the scream of the earth itself being reshaped. Minutes blurred into hours. The storm did not relent. The village became a thing of sound alone, no light, no form, just the hammering of rain and the crash of waves too near. At some point, Leif slumped beside the door, panting, his hair plastered to his face. "It'll take the boats," he said. "We should have pulled them higher." Einar stared into the fire, its glow dim but steady. "Boats can be rebuilt," he said quietly. "Men can't." There was no reply, only the storm, endless and absolute. When dawn finally came, it did so without ceremony. The rain thinned to a drizzle, the wind subsided to a sigh. What was left was silence, not peace, but the fragile stillness after survival. Einar opened the door carefully. The hinge, with moisture. Outside, the air was heavy with the scent of salt and broken things. The beach had changed shape in the night. The dunes were flattened, the sand scoured away in long, uneven ridges. The boats lay half-buried, one overturned, its ribs cracked open like a carcass. Nets tangled among seaweed and driftwood. The sky was pale, almost white, the kind of light that made everything appear washed out, unreal. Pools of seawater shimmered between the huts, reflecting fragments of the wreckage. A dead gull lay by the threshold, its wings still spread as if caught mid-flight. Leif stepped out behind him, silent. He looked toward the shore, then back toward the village. She took what she wanted. Einar nodded once. She always does. They walked down to the beach, boots sinking into the wet sand. The surf rolled in weakly now, exhausted after its fury. The air was cold, but it no longer bit. Arn followed them a few paces behind, his eyes wide at the deep into his sleeves. When they reached the first boat, Einar crouched beside it. The hull was split near the bow, but not beyond repair. He ran his hand over the break, feeling the smoothness of the exposed wood. "We'll fix her," he said. Leif looked out at the horizon. "If the sea allows it." Einar's mouth twitched, not a smile, but something close. "She always does, eventually." They stood there for a long time, saying nothing, watching the tide come and go, washing over the same of sand that had been theirs yesterday and would be again tomorrow. Behind them, the first fires were lit. Smoke rose once more, thin and blue against the pale sky. The smell of salt and wood and life began to fill the air again. The village had survived. That was all it ever needed to do. The storm left a silence that felt too large to fill. All morning the village moved through it carefully, as though afraid that sudden noise might wake something still sleeping beneath the sea. The air hung, damp and cold. The light was dull, diffused without shadow. Every hut door stood open to let out the smell of wet wood and smoke. Einar and Leif began at the shore. Their boots sank deep into the sand that had been turned and flattened by the night's tide. Seaweed lay in tangled ropes among the wreckage. Driftwood, heavy with water, lined the edge of the dunes. It was quiet work, the kind that needed no words. They salvaged what they could. A plank here, a length of rope there, pieces that might someday become part of something seaworthy again. Arn followed behind them, carrying smaller bits, setting them into piles as Einar directed. He didn't speak either. Every few moments he looked out toward the water as though expecting it to rise again. The sea lay calm, the color of pewter, its surface broken only by the faintest ripples. It was difficult to imagine that just hours before it had tried to devour everything they owned. Further along the beach, two of worked to free a net caught between rocks. It had been dragged far up the shore, half buried beneath a layer of sand and shell. Each pull brought a wet slap and the heavy smell of rot. "She's ruined," one muttered, holding up a shredded piece of rope. The other only shrugged. "Then we'll mend it. That's what we do." By midday, the tide had turned again. The water crept back, erasing their footprints one by one. The sun broke weakly through the clouds, painting the wet sand with a dull shimmer. Steam rose where it touched the darker patches of earth. The wind shifted from the west, carrying with it the faint scent of pine from the forests inland. Leif wiped the salt from his face with the back of his sleeve. It could have been worse. Einar grunted. It always could. He paused, looking toward the horizon. The line where sea met sky was flat, steady. We'll take what's left and begin again. They returned to the village, their shoulders hunched beneath the weight of wet wood and rope. The people had gathered near the central fire pit, the smoke trailing thin and blue into the still air. Someone had hung parts over the flames, and the smell of fish stew mingled with the scent of salt and soot. Women sorted through bundles of herbs, salvaged from storage before the water could spoil them. Children huddled near the fire, their faces pale from the cold but calm. Einar set down his load beside the fire, the wood hitting the ground with a dull thud. We'll need tar, he. And the cauldron from the smith's hut, Torsten nodded. It survived, the roof didn't. He gave a small, weary smile. But the sea doesn't care for roofs. The men ate standing, their bowls steaming in the grey light. The stew was thin but hot. It spread warmth through their bodies, easing the ache in their limbs. For a few moments, conversation returned, slow, cautious. They spoke of what could be repaired, of nets and sails, of timber that might be cut from the forest. Arn stood near the edge of the group, clutching his bowl, listening. He had not known a storm like this before. The older men spoke of it as if it were a season, a thing expected, endured, forgotten. To him it felt like a boundary, between before and after, between the boy he was and the man he would have to become. After they ate, Einar walked with him down to the docks. The remains of the boats lay scattered, one overturned, another split, one miraculously untouched. The tide lapped gently against them. Strange tenderness after the night's violence. Einar rested his hand on the boy's shoulder. The sea gives and takes, he said, but it never stops. You can hate it for that, or you can learn from it. Arn looked up at him, eyes bright but steady. And you? Einar's gaze followed the horizon, where the sky was beginning to clear, a faint band of gold opening in the distance. I learned to keep building. They stood there together until the sun dipped low again. The water reflected its laugh. Long, broken lines that shimmered between the wrecks. The village behind them hummed softly, the sound of hands working, of wood being cut, of something that refused to end. When the last of the daylight faded, the people gathered once more around the central fire. Someone passed a jug of ale. Someone else began a quiet song, half prayer, half memory. The flames danced in their eyes, lighting faces worn but alive. Leif leaned close to the fire, his voice low. We'll be ready by next time. Einar nodded. We always are. The sea, only a few paces away, whispered in reply, not with fury now, but with the slow, endless rhythm of its breath. The stars returned overhead, sharp and clear after the storm, reflected faintly in the wet sand below. In the flicker of firelight, the village seemed whole again. Fragile, yes, but certain in its endurance, built not upon stone or fortune, but on repetition, memory, and the quiet, unyielding labor of hands that Sky had cleared completely. The storm was gone, carried east into the grey emptiness beyond the horizon, leaving behind an air so clean it almost stung. The world smelled of sea salt and pine resin, of wet sand and smoke from rekindled hearths. The light came thin and bright across the water, gilding the broken edges of boats and the slick tops of stones. Einar rose before the others. He walked down to the beach with slow steps, the ground still soft beneath his boots. Far, exposing a field of seaweed and shell. Crabs moved in the pools left behind, their movements quick and mechanical. The sea, for once, was calm, a mirror of slow motion, its surface rippling only where the wind passed over it. He stood there for a while, watching. The storm had taken much ropes, timbers, 2 of the smaller boats, but the sea had also left gifts. A length of driftwood, perfectly straight, a fragment of a barrel carried from some far-off ship. The sea never, without returning something of itself. Leif joined him not long after, carrying a hammer and a bundle of nails wrapped in cloth. His face was tired but untroubled, his eyes squinting against the light. "We'll start with the hull," he said, nodding toward the damaged boat. "She's worth saving." Einar nodded, kneeling beside the wood. "The frame's sound, only the bow's split." Leif smiled faintly. "Then she's in better shape than most of us." The two men worked side by side in silence. Of the hammer was steady, rhythmic, blending with the slow sigh of the tide. Each strike echoed faintly off the cliffs. The smell of fresh tar rose sharp and heavy from the pot heating beside them. The morning passed like that, in work, in small motions, in the steady rhythm of repair. By midday, others had joined them. Torsten brought fresh rope, his steps uneven in the soft sand. Rurik came carrying a plank longer than himself. Even the women from the village arrived with baskets of nails, wooden pegs and lengths of wool to seal the seams. The air filled with the sound of labor, the scrape of saws, the murmur of voices, the faint clink of tools. Arn worked beside Einar, handing him nails, fetching water, watching his every movement. The boy's face was streaked with tar by the time the sun began to lower, but he didn't seem to notice. When Einar finally paused, wiping his hands on a rag, he said quietly, "You're learning faster than I did." Arn looked up, startled. "Praise, because you teach better than you were taught." Einar gave a low, rough laugh. "No one ever taught us. We just watched, failed, and tried again." Arn nodded, eyes serious. "Then I'll keep watching." By evening, the repaired boat sat upright once more, the last of the tar cooling in thick, glossy lines along its seams. It was not beautiful, but it was whole. The villagers stood around it, tired and silent, their faces lit by the orange glow of the sinking sun. Leif broke the... "First, she'll float," Torsten grunted. "Aye, and that's all a boat needs to do." The tide had begun to rise again. The waves came higher on the sand, the water whispering close to their boots. A thin wind moved across the surface, carrying with it the faint cries of gulls returning to their perches on the rocks. The sea, after all its noise, seemed almost gentle now, a great, breathing thing at rest. As the light faded, the people drifted back toward the village. Fires began to appear. One, small sparks against the deepening blue. Einar lingered behind, his hands resting on the boat's side. The wood was still warm from the day's work. Behind him, the laughter of children carried faintly through the cooling air. He turned toward the horizon one last time. The sun had fallen below the edge of the world, leaving behind a band of red that deepened into purple as the first stars appeared. The sea reflected it perfectly, as though holding the color for a moment before letting it fade. Einar stood there until the sky went dark. Only when the tide reached his boots did he step back. The repaired boat shifted slightly in its cradle, the wood creaking as if exhaling. Tomorrow they would take it out again. The nets would be cast. The sea would either give or take, as it always did. But tonight, for this one quiet night, the village slept under a calm sky, their world remade, their lives folded once more into the rhythm of the water and the wind. The sound of... Softer now, a slow and endless breathing. The firelight from the huts flickered across the sand, and above it all, the stars shone clear and sharp, unmoved, eternal, watching the small human persistence below. Dawn arrived without sound, as if even the world hesitated to disturb the calm that followed the days of wind and ruin. The horizon blushed faintly, soft pink behind a veil of mist, and the sea stretched out beneath it, still, forgiving and whole again. A thin trail of smoke. Each hut curling lazily into the pale air. Einar woke before the light had fully broken. His back ached from the work of the day before, but it was a clean ache, one that came from effort, not harm. He dressed slowly, wrapped his cloak close, and stepped outside. The sand was cold beneath his boots, his breath hung white in front of him. Down by the shore, the repaired boat waited. The wood gleamed with a thin sheen of frost, the tar dark against the pale grain. It looked smaller there, but stronger, as if the sea's anger had somehow made it more certain of its purpose. Leif was already there, coiling the last of the ropes. He looked up as Einar approached. "It's time," Einar nodded. "Aye, she's ready." The others gathered soon after, Rurik, Torsten, the boy Arn. None spoke much. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said to the sea 1,000 times before. Together they set their shoulders to the hull and pushed. The sand resisted at first, then yielded. The boat slid forward, slow and sure, until the surf reached its bow. The first wave struck and broke across their boots, cold as stone. Then came the second, gentler, lifting the boat, rocking it forward. When it floated free, they steadied it with practiced hands. The oars found their places. The ropes were coiled. The sea accepted them again without ceremony. Arn climbed aboard last, his face pale with cold but bright with something else, pride maybe or awe. He looked to Einar, who briefly and said, "Keep her steady, don't fight her, just follow her rhythm." The boy nodded. They rowed out into the widening light, the oars dipping soundlessly into the water. Behind them the village grew small, its fires no more than tiny sparks beneath the morning sky. Ahead the sea spread open, vast and clean, its color deepening to steel blue where the sun had not yet reached. The wind rose, gentle but constant, filling the small sail with a soft curve. The boat every line and joint tested and found true. The men worked in silence, each lost to his thoughts, each listening to the quiet music of wood, wind, and water. When they reached the deeper water, Einar gave the signal. The nets went out, smooth, deliberate, vanishing beneath the surface without resistance. For a long time they waited. The sea beneath them was dark, opaque, unknowable. Arn leaned forward, staring into it as if he might see the bottom. "Do you think?" he asked, quiet. "Sea remembers." Einar turned to him, the faintest trace of a smile beneath his beard. "She remembers everything," he said, "but she forgives nothing." The boy nodded, eyes still fixed on the water. The world was utterly still now, suspended between sky and depth. Even the gulls had fallen silent. The sea breathed beneath them, and the men, without knowing it, matched their breathing to its rhythm. Then the rope trembled. Once, then again. The first pull came heavy, then sure. The net rose, glittering, alive with silver motion. The morning sun broke fully over the horizon, turning every drop of water into light. The men hauled together, laughing through their effort, the sound bright and human against the boundless quiet of the sea. When the net cleared the water, it burst with fish, herring bright and wet, flapping against the deck. The boat rocked, the men shouting, grinning like boys. Even Einar smiled fully now, the lines around his eyes deepening. For a long time they worked, their arms burning, the sea sparkling around them. The catch was good, better than they had dared to hope. When the last of the nets was hauled in, the boat lay heavy in the water, the hold full. The men sat where they were, breathing hard, faces wet with spray and light. Einar looked toward the shore, now a thin ribbon of green and grey. The smoke from the huts rose straight into the sky. "Let's go home," he said quietly. They turned the boat, the oars dipping once more into the sea. The war parted before them, smooth as silk. Behind them the sun climbed higher, scattering gold across the surface. Ahead the land waited, unchanged, familiar, eternal. As they drew closer, the sounds of the village reached them again. Dogs barking, voices calling, the crackle of morning fires. The sea sighed softly behind them, retreating without resentment, as if content to let them go, for now. And as the boat slid back onto the sand, and hands reached out to pull them home, toward the open water. The light shimmered there, endless, beckoning, alive. Tomorrow they would return, and the sea would still be waiting,